Hello and welcome to What is Aging, our introductory video on the basic biology of aging, at least according to the four-process model, which is a new model as of early 2026 that you may have guessed describes aging as four distinct processes. It is still fairly theoretical though, so you're not watching a video about a proven theory, if such a thing could be said to exist. I am Dr. James Wordsworth. That's me there at a wedding, having completely cleared the dance floor with my rock and dance moves. So let's jump right in. So what is aging is obviously one of the greatest questions of our time. And the answer, at the moment at least, usually looks something like this. So this is the standard introduction to many biology of aging papers, where we say aging is a multifactorial complex process. But what does that really mean? Well, in my opinion at least, that really means I have no idea what I'm talking about. It's basically a glorified shrug. It doesn't really mean anything. So a rough definition of aging is not just the changes that occur over time. It's generally thought to be specific processes or a process that results in changes in our robustness. And these are distinct from things like being hit by a plane or falling into a volcano or even infections. They're generally thought to be intrinsic or internal processes, for example, like the breaking of our DNA or the mutation of our DNA. And this is thought to lead to very specific age-related diseases. Usually as well, it's decreases in robustness as opposed to things like development, which actually increase our robustness. And of course, aging could still be happening during this time, but it's only after development ceases that we really begin to see declines in our robustness due to aging, including death. But of course, no one really knows what aging is. Some people think that aging is in fact just a continuation of development. Just as when we fill a bath at the beginning, it's getting better and better because we have a bigger and nicer bath. But if you keep filling it for too long, eventually you end up swimming to your kitchen. And the same process of development could begin to reduce our robustness. So there are two main theories about aging. The first one being that as we get damage to our DNA, this accumulates over time and causes aging. And the second one being this developmental process where we get a full bath and then an overflowing one. However, these two main theories are rife with inconsistencies and paradoxes. I'm not going to explain it right now, but hopefully that will be a video released in future. But at this current point in time, some scientists are suggesting that aging is so complicated that we'll never understand it, or at least we shouldn't bother trying at the moment. So instead, we've turned to this collection of what we call the hallmarks of aging, which explain aging not as a causal process, but a distinct collection of biomarkers and hallmarks which define what aging looks like. And this, of course, has implications for translational research. While we can still have great studies that look at how things like diet and medicine and topicals affect these hallmarks, and we can even say that this correlates with changes or benefits to health, what it's much more difficult to look for is the why. We don't know why these things are having beneficial effects, and we don't know if it relates to the specific processes of aging. For that, we need to understand aging as more than a collection of hallmarks. We need to understand the system. So currently there are two ways of doing that. We have the so-called top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. Half of this we're doing really well. So the top-down approach, such as looking at a forest from above so that you can see all the glorious detail. We have so many studies looking at all the different omic data sets, the genome, the proteome, the transcriptome, the epigenome. And what that's telling us, of course, is all the connections and correlations across the system. But of course, without the second half, all this is really telling us is that aging is a complex multifactorial process. To understand the why, we require models. We require the bottom-up approach. We need to start with a tree and find another tree and another tree, and we need to see how those trees connect together to make a forest. This allows us to make predictions and evaluate cause and effect rather than just simple correlation. So why aren't we doing this? Because aging is such a complex multifactorial process. When we try to make models with our current understanding, we start with something like reactive oxygen species or ultraviolet radiation inducing damage to our DNA usually, which causes either signaling noise or it damages our telomeres and causes cell senescence, and this causes inflammation, and both of these lead to things like cell death, which supposedly causes aging through cell loss. When we actually try to build systems of this model, it's full of inconsistencies and paradoxes. It just doesn't make any sense. And they produce totally unworkable and unimaginable systems, as I've suggested, hopefully I will cover in another video. And really, when we say things like aging is a complex multifactorial process, what we mean is the systems that we are trying to build with the information that we think is true don't work. They don't fit together in a way that makes sense, so they're complex. So the purpose of the 4-process model is to remove this complexity. It's to turn aging back into something that we understand by splitting it up into 4 processes which allow us to assess the initial cause all the way through to the ultimate outcomes in a causal framework. And this is currently available in bioarchives. It still involves DNA damage as the initial cause, but instead of going through this pathway that doesn't make any sense, it's suggesting that we look at a specific type of DNA damage that influences selection. So, for example, if we were to have a cell with DNA damage in a gene that allows it to divide and replicate and metabolize faster, then that cell suddenly has a selective advantage or an advantage over the cells around it. It can divide faster than them so that when there's a space, it fills it. And over time, it can overtake the tissue. And what that means is that our tissue should be getting more metabolically active until supposedly this should kill us. One possible way it could do so is by exhausting all of the energy in our bodies as our cells get faster and faster and faster. Now, this does appear to be happening in some organs under some circumstances. For example, when we have highly damaged organs, we get lots of cell death, and we get lots of compensatory proliferation. So our organs are trying to maintain their size whilst experiencing large amounts of cell death. And what that leads to is 2 main diseases, fibrosis and cancer, which are essentially diseases of overactive cells. And in fibrosis, you also get production of lots of extracellular matrix proteins such as collagen. And in cancer, you can even see how the tumors extract nutrients from the surrounding tissues, depleting them of energy. But of course, most of aging looks like the precise opposite of this. So we decided to call this process 1 celeresis, meaning the generation of speed. So we're suggesting that this is happening when things go wrong. It's happening when you get lots of damage in bad tissues. But of course, it should be happening everywhere. This is the natural course of selection in tissues. You have faster cells, they have a natural advantage, and they should overtake or overcome the rest of the tissue. So if this is not happening, it suggests we must have some kind of defense mechanism to prevent it. And what we're suggesting this defense mechanism is that when our slower cells, shown here on the left with a tortoise shell, recognize a cell that is metabolizing faster than them and may reflect a dangerous mutant, what they can do is they can communicate to that cell that it needs to slow down, and they can induce permanent epigenetic marks which cause the cell to slow. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term epigenetic, when you have a gene that's determined by a sequence of bases and you get a mutation, that is a genetic change that will then alter the structure of the gene. But when you have epigenetic marks, they don't alter the genetic sequence and the gene is the same. But what these marks can do is that when they change, they could, for example, alter the expression of the genes. They could change how much protein it produces. And we published this idea in 2022, calling the second process intrinsic aging, which basically is causing body and cells to slow down, metabolic slowdown. And the natural result of metabolic slowdown is you do less translation, less proliferation, less DNA replication over time. And when you do this, all of these processes require ATP, so you're using less ATP, which causes ATP to build up. And when ATP builds up, our cells generally don't like that because we have multiple homeostatic mechanisms to make sure that we always have the right levels of energy. So when we have more ATP, we reduce the processes that produce it. And that restores our ATP balance, our ATP homeostasis, but at the same time means we're burning less of the sugar and lipid fuels which create ATP. So these will then start to build up in our cells. So when this happens, our cells have a defense mechanism to restore their sugar and lipid homeostasis, which involves reducing how much they import. So they do this by reducing the insulin receptor, which causes them to take more sugar and lipid from the blood. And of course, whilst that restores their sugar and lipid homeostasis, it induces insulin resistance, which is one of the primary changes we currently associate with aging. And of course, to restore our blood's sugar and lipid levels, we push those additional fuels into our fat cells, our adipocytes, and we cause weight gain, which is again another of those changes that we often see happening with age. And when our fat cells become full of fat, what they do is they secrete things called inflammatory cytokines, which attract macrophages to eat the cells, and that restores our adipose homeostasis, but at the same time causes chronic inflammation, a third major change that we associate with aging. And sadly, that is not even the end. Now, our major fat storage tissue is what we call our subcutaneous fat, our subcutaneous adipose tissue, which is our long-term fat storage tissue, as opposed to our visceral adipose tissue, which is a short-term storage under conditions of stress. So we have a big sensitivity differential, which causes most of our fuels to be stored in our subcutaneous adipose. But of course, as we undergo metabolic slowdown, and our subcutaneous adipose gets full, the sensitivity differential disappears, and more of these fuels is pushed to our visceral adipose stores, which causes visceral weight gain, metabolic syndrome, and even type 2 diabetes. So, the result of this energy cascade is a third process, which we've called extrinsic aging, which is essentially the cascade of processes whereby our body attempts to adapt to being slower metabolically, leading to metabolic syndrome. And this even links with cortisol, one of the major stress hormones, which is also involved in pushing these fuels away from the subcutaneous to the visceral adipose stores. So that is why stress contributes to extrinsic aging. So intrinsic and extrinsic aging then are two separate processes, both increasing our mortality. Intrinsic aging is going on underneath. Its epigenetic change is causing our tissues to get slower and slower and slower. It's irreversible by most behavioral interventions. But at the same time, we have this energy cascade occurring, and we get the build-up of these sugars and lipids. So any behaviors which alter these will affect our extrinsic aging, and that can be done in the short term by the different interventions. For example, being sedentary will increase extrinsic age, exercise should reduce it, the same thing for ad libitum feeding and calorie restriction. And what that also means is that doing these things later in life will have much greater effect on your mortality, which explains one of the biggest paradoxes of aging, that this supposedly intrinsic process is relatively unaffected by our genes. It's much more affected by our environment. And that is because extrinsic aging, which is so modulatable by our behaviors, will have much more of an effect on our mortality towards the end of life, which is when most people die. So the three processes are intrinsic aging, which is designed to stop celeresis, also produces extrinsic aging, and all of these together will contribute to age-related diseases, which I'm not going to explain here, but is explained in another video that should already be available, which I will discuss at the end. So the four-process model links together all of these different features which we know affect aging. And what you find if you put all these together is you connect up all of the molecules and pathways and processes that we know are heavily associated with aging. And I'm not going to explain all of this detail here, but hopefully I will do in more videos to come. Combined, this forms a kind of a longevity module, and if you tried to put all these hallmarks into this system, you would quickly find that they fit in really nicely. And what this allows us to do is go from a understanding of aging in terms of correlative biomarkers and hallmarks to more of a mechanistic understanding. We can go from saying we have no idea what we're talking about to an actual definition of aging as 4 distinct processes which cause disease by known mechanisms. Now, the more astute listeners have probably realized that I keep saying the 4-process model, but I'm only talking about 3 processes. So in addition to this video about the age-related diseases and another one talking about anti-aging therapies, there is also a separate video on the 4th process of the 4-process model. If you would like to subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch these videos, that's great. You could also go to agingrethink.com to see some of the other materials we might have available. There is also a podcast, Undoing Aging, where I interview people about their research. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that, and please check out our other materials.